I rise today in opposition to the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act of 2011. Rather than taking a balanced approach that requires shared sacrifice, House Republicans have passed legislation that would gut essential services for average Americans, asking nothing of the wealthy and the privileged. Such a misguided approach would cost countless American jobs while doing nothing to solve America's long-term deficit challenges. Madam President, in my opinion, this bill, the Cut, Cap, and Balance Act, fails to measure up as a serious proposal to address the structural deficit that our nation faces. It is misguided and assumes that our nation will pay no price if we fail to invest in our future. And these are some of the assumptions of this measure. Highways will not buckle, they say. Pipes will not rust. Bridges will not collapse. And there's no need to invest in the next generation of innovators to keep America's competitive advantage. This bill, Mr. President, would gut the very funding we need to revitalize our economy and invest in the future. Cut, Cap, and Balance would render Congress essentially powerless to address revenues, thereby pushing America further down the road to economic inequality by ensuring that the wealthy do not have to share any sacrifice. And whatever might be said about this legislation, to call it balanced is a cruel irony. In fact, all of the sacrifices demanded of the poor and the working families. This measure forces Congress to slash programs that average Americans rely on for education, housing assistance, food safety, safer air control, and clean water. But, Mr. President, we have an aging population, which means that increasing costs for Social Security and Medicare are a reality that must be dealt with. The baby boomers, for example, are retiring now, which increases the need for Social Security and Medicare. And while those programs are not subject to sequester, how will we meet the higher costs and at the same time bring down overall spending to 18% of gross profit, a level that has not been achieved since the 60s? My colleagues should not kid themselves. Mandating a balanced budget by 2020 while taking revenues off the table will require draconian cuts to Social Security and Medicare. Mr. President, as chairman of the Appropriations Committee, I take particular note of the impact Cut, Cap, and Balance would have on non-defense discretionary spending. A 10-year freeze on domestic spending that does not adjust for inflation would have a devastating effect and impact on the ability of all non-defense departments and agencies to carry out their missions. My colleagues should know that over 10 years, such a cap would amount to a 33% cut in real dollars. Such a level of cuts would make it impossible for the United States to compete on a global scale. Our infrastructure, our education system, our technology, everything we need to remain a great nation will be drastically underfunded or simply not funded at all. Mr. President, I hope we all understand that we're not talking about nice-to-have things. We are talking about investments that are necessary to maintain the quality of life for the middle class. Education is not optional. Roads and sewers, clean air, and clean water are not optional. Meeting the basic nutritional needs of our poorest children should not be optional. This great nation, Mr. President, was built on such investments made in the best interest of the American people, all the people, Mr. President, not just the wealthiest 1/10 of 1%. Now, I would like to take a brief moment to provide a few specifics about the impact of this act. While it is not possible to predict specific impacts 10 years down the road, it is certainly possible to give examples of what the American people would experience in the near term as a result of this deeply flawed bill. In fiscal year 2012, Head Start funding would decrease by more than $900 million, eliminating comprehensive early childhood services for over 130,000 low-income children and their families, resulting in the termination of 30,000 teachers, teacher assistants, and related staff. The combined cost of mandatory programs such as food stamps, school lunch program, coupled with domestic spending reductions contained in this bill, would be a double blow to the nation's most vulnerable populations. With these cuts, there would be 13 million fewer meals served to our seniors who can't afford it. So let me be blunt. If this bill is enacted, children and seniors in this great nation will go hungry in far larger numbers than today. Mr. President, we all recognize that reducing waste, fraud, and abuse are essential components of getting our fiscal house in order. For example, every $1 billion we save is $1 billion we can use to reduce the deficit or better invest in America's future. And yet this bill would reduce funding for the Internal Revenue Service by some $1.8 billion below the President's request for fiscal year 2012, which would cripple its effort to fund fraud and eliminate waste and abuse. The IRS could be forced to furlough between 4,100 and 5,000 employees, and most of them are enforcement agents. Furthermore, a cut to IRS funding would increase the deficit by about $4 billion a year, beginning in 2013. Because, Mr. President, keep in mind that every dollar investment in law enforcement resources brings in $5 in tax revenues. Those are facts established over the years. Finally, Mr. President, I would note that a cap on the federal budget means that we are unable to make smart choices between our future investments. As an example, the Bureau of Prisons inmate population is expected to grow roughly 250,000 federal inmates by 2018, an increase of more than 31,000 prisoners, or 15% over the next 8 years. A growing inmate population coupled with a spending cap for Department of Justice activities will mean further severe cuts to other functions of the Department of Justice. Federal, state, and local public safety efforts would be cut in order to pay the required cost of housing prisoners. Mr. President, yesterday, as we recall, 97 senators voted in favor of the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs Appropriations Bill. This shows that the Senate is capable of producing and passing fiscally responsible appropriation bills that meets the nation's needs and that are strong in bipartisan support. The real answer to our fiscal crisis has not changed before the debate began. We must cut spending in a responsible fashion. We must reform entitlement programs to make certain that they survive for future generations. and we must reform our tax code to allow for sufficient revenues to meet the needs of an aging population and the challenges of a global economy. Mr. President, cup, cap, and balance does none of these things, and so I urge my colleagues respectfully to reject this misguided measure.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, while the distinguished Chairman of the Appropriations Committee was talking, I had a visit with some of the pages here to ask them did they realize who was speaking. And they all knew who he was. They knew that he was a heroic man having the Medal of Honor. They knew he had been elected to the Senate 9 different times, in addition to serving in the House of Representatives. So it's great that our pages are so versed on what happens around here. We depend on them very, very much. And I'm grateful that they understand what a great man Chairman of the Appropriations Committee is.